Welcome to Purbright Files, uncovering truths behind every mystery.
The village of St. Aldwyth was the sort of place that looked as though it had been designed to reassure the human heart. Nestled between the soft sweep of English countryside and the reflective waters of Kingfisher Lake, its cottages leaned toward one another with the familiarity of old friends. Window boxes spilled with geraniums, hedges were clipped to a uniform neatness, and the air carried the faint perfume of lilac and roses. On that early June evening, it seemed as though nothing dark or disruptive could possibly intrude upon the harmony of such a setting. And yet, as Miss Jane Marple had observed many times in her long life, it was precisely in such places that darkness often showed itself most unexpectedly. Human nature, after all, was the same in the country as in the city, and envy, resentment and folly did not wither in the presence of climbing roses. The annual garden fete was one of the most anticipated events in St. Aldwyth's calendar, and this year it was held on the expansive lawns of Colonel Mortimer's lakeside estate. By late afternoon, tables were laden with cakes, pies and trifles. The vicar had blessed the raffle baskets, and a determined brass band had begun to play its repertoire of jaunty marches. Bright paper lanterns swayed from the branches, preparing to glow once the twilight deepened. Children darted about with sticky buns, while their mothers kept a watchful eye on both the little ones and one another. Miss Marple, wrapped in a light grey shawl despite the warmth of the evening, had taken up her customary position at the edge of the gathering. She had a wicker chair with a good view of both the bandstand and the lake beyond. From here she could enjoy her tea, observe the mingling of neighbours, and in her quiet way take note of those small details of manner and expression which others more occupied with chatter and display were prone to overlook. Colonel Mortimer himself was making a fine show of joviality, though Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes, noticed how he looked a trifle too often toward his wife, as though concerned that she might object to his attentions to one of the younger ladies. Mortimer, a tall and commanding woman, busied herself with the cake competition, issuing instructions as though she were directing a battalion. Her lips, however, had pressed into a line when she caught her husband lingering too long near the refreshment table with Mrs. Lydia Fenton, a widow known for her lively eyes and bright laughter. Near the edge of the lawn, Mr. Harrison, the village solicitor, bent his head to speak earnestly to Miss Clara Bell, the piano teacher. Both pretended it was no more than polite conversation, but the very stiffness of their posture betrayed that something more significant passed between them. A few paces away, young Thomas Weaver stood alone, his hands thrust into his pockets, his expression that of a man who felt both excluded and resentful. His gaze followed Arthur Pritchard, the wealthy mill owner, who was moving through the crowd with the air of a man who considered himself master of all he surveyed. Arthur Pritchard was not beloved in St. Aldwyth. He was successful, certainly, but he had made his fortune by ruthless methods, and he carried himself with a smugness that rubbed many raw. It was whispered that he had ruined competitors without mercy and that he kept the mill workers' wages lower than was fair. Yet wealth and position commanded a certain deference, and so he was invited, greeted, and even flattered. Miss Marple, however, had noted how several pairs of eyes followed him with ill-concealed dislike. The fete drifted into evening, the music shifting to a waltz. Laughter rose and mingled with the occasional shout of children by the water's edge. The lanterns glowed, their reflections quivering on the still surface of the lake. It was then, at the height of the merriment, that a scream split the night. It came from the direction of the boathouse, a high, piercing cry that sent a shudder through the crowd and caused the dancers to falter mid-step. For a moment silence reigned, broken only by the echo of the brass band's halted notes. Then a young maid, Elsie Hardwicke, came running, her apron stained with grass, her face as white as linen. Oh, Lord preserve us, it's Mr. Pritchard. He's in the lake. He's dead." The crowd erupted. Men rushed toward the boathouse, women clutched at one another, and children were hurriedly gathered close. Colonel Mortimer barked orders, though his voice wavered. A group waded into the reeds with lanterns held high, their lights flickering on the ripples. Moments later, they returned carrying the limp form of Arthur Pritchard. His evening coat was sodden, clinging to his body, and his head lolled at an unnatural angle. His face, pale beneath the dripping hair, left no doubt. A horrified murmur rippled through the villagers. One or two declared at once that it must have been an accident, that Pritchard had stumbled, perhaps after too much wine. Others whispered more darkly, pointing out that he was a strong swimmer, and the lake shallow near the shore. A voice muttered that plenty in St. Aldwyth might have wished him ill. Miss Marple, who had risen to her feet but remained calm amidst the tumult, set her teacup gently on the table beside her chair. Her expression was composed, even gentle, but her pale eyes were sharp with thought. She watched as the men laid Pritchard on the grass, as the vicar murmured a prayer, as Mrs. Mortimer pressed a handkerchief to her lips. She noticed the way Thomas Weaver stared at the body with a stricken look, the way Mrs. Lydia Fenton turned her head too quickly aside, and the way the solicitor, Mr. Harrison, adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand. To most, it appeared to be a sudden and tragic accident, the sort of misfortune that could occur even on the loveliest of evenings. But to Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to see how often tragedy was born of deliberate design rather than chance, the scene carried a familiar weight. She did not say a word aloud, but in her heart she knew this was no accident. The fete broke apart like a dropped teacup, the pieces scattering in every direction. Colonel Mortimer, flustered and red in the face, ordered the grounds cleared, while Mrs. Mortimer snapped at servants to gather lanterns and send for the doctor. Yet even as the villagers drifted away from the lawns in small, uneasy groups, their voices lowered and their heads close together, no one returned home in silence. The discovery of Arthur Pritchard's body was too shocking, too ripe with suggestion, to allow for anything but speculation. By the time Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the vicarage, arm in arm with Mrs. Dawes, who insisted on escorting her part of the way, the night air was filled with the hum of whispered theories. Some swore it had been a simple misstep by the water's edge, perhaps after too much wine. Others, with a relish for the darker side of life, suggested that Pritchard had been struck down by some sudden seizure, or that the lake had claimed him like an avenging spirit. A few, lowering their voices further, admitted that if ever a man had made enemies enough to wish him dead, it was Arthur Pritchard. The next morning, St. Aldwyth awoke not to its usual peaceful rhythm of milk deliveries, church bells and gossip over hedges, but to a buzz that reached from cottage to cottage before the breakfast plates had even cooled. Miss Hewitt, whose husband had been among the men to drag Pritchard's body from the reeds, told the baker that Pritchard's face had borne a peculiar expression, shock perhaps, or fear. The baker, in turn, informed half his customers before noon. By midday, the entire village was discussing not only how the man had ended in the water, but who might have benefited from it. Miss Marple, who took her tea as usual in the morning room of her cottage, did not hurry to join the talk. She had a little basket of mending on her lap, and though her hands worked with steady precision, her mind wandered back to the fete. She recalled Mrs. Mortimer's strained smile, the nervous laugh of Lydia Fenton, the way young Thomas Weaver had stood so alone, his eyes smouldering with something like resentment. It was never the grand gestures that told the tale, Miss Marple reflected, but the small things, a glance, a hesitation, an overeager word. By afternoon, Inspector Graves had arrived from the nearby town. He was a tall man with a bristling mustache and a manner that suggested he considered country folk both quaint and simple. Standing at the gates of the Mortimer estate, he addressed a gathering of villagers with brisk efficiency. Pritchard's death, he announced, was almost certainly accidental. Still, an inquest would be held. Until then, the matter was not to be treated as a crime unless fresh evidence suggested otherwise. The villagers were not so easily reassured. An accident was possible, yes, but Arthur Pritchard had not been the sort to slip meekly into death. He was a strong man, vigorous, and no friend to many. As the inspector moved about the grounds with his notebook, half a dozen theories sprang up in the lanes and drawing rooms. Mrs. Dawes told her husband that she was quite sure Pritchard had been drinking too much champagne. She had seen him laugh too loudly at Mrs. Fenton's jokes. Harrison, the solicitor, suggested he might have suffered a cramp, recalling a case he had once read about. Miss Clara Bell whispered to her closest pupil's mother that Pritchard had been cruel in business, and that retribution, however dreadful, sometimes came upon such men in unexpected ways. It was in the shop, the post office, and the churchyard that the darker speculation spread most freely. Someone remembered that Thomas Weaver had quarrelled openly with Pritchard only days before, furious at the mill owner for refusing to employ him. Others recalled that Mrs. Mortimer had looked less than pleased when Pritchard bent his head to Lydia Fenton at the fete. A few mentioned debts old unpaid or bitterly resented. Everyone had a story to tell, and each story shifted the shadow of suspicion from one villager to another, as though guilt were a garment being tried on for size. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Price at the bakery that afternoon, ostensibly to order a small seed cake. She listened, as she always did, more than she spoke, nodding gently as Mrs. Price repeated the tale of the strange look on Pritchard's face, like a man who's had a nasty surprise, the baker's wife concluded. Miss Marple agreed that life was full of such surprises, and that they were rarely of the pleasant sort. When she returned home, she found a note slipped under her door by young Timothy, the vicar's errand boy. It was from Mrs. Mortimer, written in her sharp, slanted hand, requesting Miss Marple's presence the following day. "You are a woman of wisdom, Miss Marple," the note read. "I should value your counsel at this difficult time." Miss Marple set the note aside and returned to her mending, her needles clicking softly. She had no doubt Mrs. Mortimer's request was more than a matter of comfort. Behind the words she sensed a hint of fear. The colonel's wife, she suspected, had seen or guessed something that troubled her. That night, as the moon rose once more over the lake, the village settled into an uneasy quiet. Curtains were drawn early, lamps turned low. Yet behind the lace and chintz, tongues wagged still. In St. Aldwyth, secrets had a way of surfacing as surely as a body in water. Miss Marple, sitting by her bedroom window with the lamplight at her shoulder, thought of Pritchard's face, of the hurried whispers, of the subtle tensions at the fete. There were things she did not yet know, but she was certain of one thing. Arthur Pritchard had not merely drowned. Someone, somewhere among her neighbours, had helped him into that lake, and sooner or later, the truth would show itself as it always did, in the small, telling ways of human nature. By morning, the entire village was alive with speculation, louder and bolder than the whisperings of the night before. What had begun as quiet mutterings at doorsteps turned into firm declarations, offered with the confidence of those who had pieced together the truth in their own minds. It was not in St. Aldwyth's nature to let such an event pass without every tongue turning it over from every angle. People carried baskets to the grocer's more for the purpose of exchanging tidings than buying food, and errands multiplied tenfold as villagers found reasons to call on one another. Thomas Weaver's name was on nearly every lip. He had argued with Arthur Pritchard in the street just days earlier, a quarrel witnessed by at least half a dozen people. Thomas, red-faced and indignant, had accused Pritchard of cheating his father in business years ago, and of refusing him work at the mill now. Pritchard, in his usual sneering fashion, had laughed and called him lazy. It was, so many now declared, the kind of quarrel that could fester and ignite into violence. At the post office, Mrs. Price told anyone within hearing that she had seen Thomas brooding alone by the lake during the fete. Sulking like a boy denied his supper, she added with a sniff. Old Mr. Carter, leaning on his walking stick, replied that young men with tempers were dangerous creatures. By the time the grocer weighed out half a pound of sugar for Miss Bell, the story had already grown. Thomas had been seen following Pritchard down toward the boathouse, though no one could quite say who had witnessed it first. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, lost no time in seizing upon this convenient suspect. He interviewed Thomas that very afternoon in front of the Mortimer estate, his bristling mustache twitching with satisfaction. The questions were blunt, the tone accusatory. Had Thomas been near the water? Had he confronted Pritchard? Had he perhaps, in a fit of temper, struck him? Thomas, pale and stammering, denied it all. He had gone to the fete, only to find the company uncomfortable, he explained. He had lingered by the lake to escape the noise and to cool his temper. Yes, but he had never approached Pritchard. His words, though earnest, carried the uncertain air of a man who feared he would not be believed. And indeed, to those watching from a discreet distance, his protestations rang hollow, if only because suspicion had already marked him out. Miss Marple, who had quietly taken up a place on a garden bench nearby, did not interrupt or volunteer her opinion. She observed, as she so often did, with her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her face mild and sympathetic. She noticed the way Thomas's eyes flickered, not with guilt but with a kind of frightened indignation, as though he were bewildered by being cast as villain. She noted, too, how several villagers stood a little apart, nodding knowingly as though their theory had been proven. People, Miss Marple reflected, always preferred a simple answer, even if it were the wrong one. That evening at the vicarage, Mrs. Dawes was already repeating that Thomas was as good as guilty. Hot temper, lack of work, and a grudge, she told the vicar's wife. It's always the same with young men. They brood, they strike out, and then they deny it. You mark my words, the vicar's wife, though less certain, admitted that such things had been known before. Miss Marple took her tea with quiet composure, listening. She was not inclined to defend Thomas aloud. A village eager for a scapegoat could not easily be swayed by gentle contradiction. Better, she thought, to let the tide of opinion run its course, for in the end, truth would never rest comfortably in borrowed clothing. Walking home beneath the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple's mind turned to other small matters that others ignored. She remembered the torn ribbon near the refreshment table, bright blue against the grass, as though ripped hastily from a dress or bonnet. She thought of the walking stick left oddly out of place near the path to the boathouse. Such things might mean nothing at all, yet in her experience, it was precisely such trifles that often proved to be the key. The lake, now quiet under the evening sky, gave no hint of the turmoil it had caused, but Miss Marple, pausing by her gate, felt a certainty settle over her as firm as her belief in the regularity of human nature. Thomas Weaver was not the answer, no matter how neatly he fit the villager's tale. The true story, she suspected, lay elsewhere, woven among the little gestures, the concealed glances, and the old wounds that had surfaced at the fete. And as she entered her cottage and set the kettle to boil, she thought again of Arthur Pritchard's face, pale and twisted in the lantern light, not the look of a man felled by chance or clumsiness, but the look of a man who had seen death reach for him in a form he recognized all too well. Inspector Graves prided himself on being a man of clear sight. He had dealt with thefts, assaults, and the occasional crime of passion in the nearby town, and to his mind, the business of Arthur Pritchard's death was straightforward. A young man with a temper, a public quarrel, and an opportunity by the lakeside. What more did one need? Evidence, perhaps. But Graves was not the sort to trouble himself overly with subtlety when a neat suspect presented himself. On the morning after his first questioning, he summoned Thomas Weaver to the constable's office in the village hall. A handful of villagers, curious by nature, lingered outside on the pretext of errands, hoping to overhear. Inside, Thomas sat stiffly, his hands clenched on his knees, while the inspector leaned forward with the air of a man about to extract a confession. "You quarrelled with him, lad," Graves said, moustache bristling as he spoke. "Everyone in St. Aldwyth knows it. You had cause, you had anger, and you had the chance. You expect me to believe you let the man walk by without so much as a word?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I was angry, yes, but I'm no murderer. I went down to the lake to be away from him, not to follow. I never touched him. I swear it." The inspector snorted. "A hot-headed fellow like you? I think you struck him, whether with your fists or a stone or some other means, and in he went. You didn't reckon the lake would betray you by holding him fast." The boy shook his head miserably. "It isn't true. He was alive when I left the lake. I heard voices on the path. He wasn't alone." That remark, Miss Marple thought, as she sat in a corner of the office where she had been permitted to bring in tea, was of more importance than Graves realized. She looked up mildly from her knitting, which she had brought along, and asked in her gentle voice, "Voices, Mr. Weaver. That's interesting. Did you recognize them?" Thomas turned his head sharply, his eyes desperate. "No, Miss Marple. I couldn't. It was only a moment, and I didn't want to be seen myself, so I moved away." Graves waved his hand impatiently. "Imagined voices, nothing more. You'll do yourself no favors inventing fancies." But Miss Marple did not think Thomas fanciful. His insistence had the earnest ring of truth, and she filed the matter away with her usual care. By afternoon, word had already spread that Thomas was as good as arrested. Mrs. Dawes repeated it to the grocer with a solemn nod. Mrs. Price declared it was only what she had expected, and Mr. Carter said he had always suspected the lad would come to a bad end. Even the vicar, though gentler in his opinion, confessed that the evidence seemed uncomfortably against the boy. Yet, Miss Marple could not reconcile Thomas with the image of Arthur Pritchard's death. A hot temper did not fit with the expression of startled fear she had glimpsed on the dead man's face. Anger might drive a man to a blow, yes, but fear suggested a recognition, an awareness of betrayal, of danger from a quarter he had not anticipated. That evening, Miss Marple took it upon herself to pay a visit to Mrs. Mortimer. The Colonel's wife received her in the drawing-room, stiff and pale, with a decanter of sherry untouched on the table. "You'll understand, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice, "that I am most anxious for all this to be settled quickly. The scandal of a murder attached to the fete, our fete, would do irreparable harm." Miss Marple inclined her head. "One always prefers things neat, of course, though life has a way of refusing neatness." Mrs. Mortimer pressed her lips together, then leaned forward suddenly. "Tell me truly, do you think that boy guilty?" Miss Marple's blue eyes were kind but steady. "I think him angry, frightened, and perhaps foolish, but not guilty. Not of this." Mrs. Mortimer's hands twisted in her lap. For a moment, Miss Marple wondered if she might confide some deeper worry, but the woman only said, "It would be better for all of us if the inspector were right. Better if it were just a rash act by a thoughtless youth." Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often drew out more than questions did. Indeed, Mrs. Mortimer turned away after a pause, muttering, "There are things one cannot say." When Miss Marple returned home under the first silver glimmer of moonlight, she reflected on the curious balance of human nature. The inspector saw only what was convenient. The villagers saw what fit their appetite for gossip, but she had seen the small details, the ribbon torn from a bonnet, the walking stick out of place, the flicker of fear in Mrs. Mortimer's eyes when she spoke of scandal. None of these things proved anything in themselves, yet taken together they painted a picture quite unlike the inspector's neat solution. As she drew her curtains, Miss Marple thought again of the boy's words. Voices by the path, unseen but heard. If true, they pointed to a presence at the lake that night, someone who did not wish to be named, and in her experience, those who did not wish to be named were very often the ones most worth remembering. The following morning dawned with the kind of brightness that made the village look deceptively innocent. The cottages with their neat gardens, the church spire standing proud, and the chatter of sparrows in the hedges all conspired to suggest a world untouched by malice. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion and unease moved like dark water under thin ice. Miss Marple, as she set about tidying her sitting room and feeding the canary, was acutely aware of it. She had learned long ago that evil rarely arrived with thunder and lightning. It came quietly, hidden under ordinary days. She walked down to the grocer's that morning, her knitting bag over her arm, and took the long way through the green. The scene of the fete still bore its scars. Trampled grass, toppled bunting, and an abandoned wooden stool gave the place a forlorn air. Near the edge of the green, almost caught in a bramble bush, Miss Marple noticed a ribbon, a pale pink one, satin, frayed at the edges, as if torn. She stooped, her joints creaking, and examined it carefully. A bonnet ribbon, surely, not a child's, but a woman's, wide and smooth. She tucked it into her bag with the same unobtrusive air with which she might have collected a dropped handkerchief. At the grocer's, the conversation was all of Thomas Weaver's guilt. Mrs. Dawes declared with relish that the inspector would have him in irons by the week's end, while Mr. Carter muttered about how such things came of letting young men idle about the village with no proper work. Miss Marple listened, adding her small, quiet observations, never argumentative, always polite. She had discovered over the years that people spoke more freely when they believed she agreed with them, and so she learned that Arthur Pritchard had been seen walking away from the fete with his stick, an old, heavy walking stick with a silver knob at the end. It had not been found with his body. That detail lodged firmly in her mind. A man like Arthur would not leave behind something he valued. If the stick was missing, someone had taken it or hidden it. The thought troubled her as she walked home. Later that afternoon, she received a visit from young Lucy Price, the vicar's daughter. The girl was pale, her eyes wide, and her hands trembled as she twisted her gloves. "I don't like what people are saying, Miss Marple," she burst out. "They're making Thomas sound like a monster, and he isn't. He's hot-tempered, yes, but he's kind too. He couldn't have. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "I dare say it's hard to see someone you care for under suspicion. But sometimes, my dear, people's hearts are not as straightforward as we imagine. That does not mean Thomas is guilty. But it does mean we must look carefully at all the pieces of the puzzle." Lucy bit her lip. "There's something I heard that I didn't tell the inspector, because he'd only laugh. When I was leaving the fete, I heard Mrs. Mortimer speaking sharply to Arthur by the edge of the green. I didn't catch the words, but she sounded, oh, almost desperate. And Arthur laughed, a horrid, mocking laugh. Then I hurried away because I thought it was no business of mine." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she merely nodded. "Thank you, dear child. That is most helpful." When Lucy had gone, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, the needles idle. Piece by piece, the pattern was emerging. A ribbon torn from a bonnet, a missing walking stick, a quarrel between Arthur and Mrs. Mortimer, overheard by a girl too timid to interfere, and Thomas's words. Voices on the path, unseen but present. It was all beginning to suggest something far more complicated than the inspector's simple tale of a jealous youth striking out in anger. This was not a matter of chance, nor of passion alone. It had the flavor of calculation, of hidden motives carefully guarded. That evening, as twilight deepened and the air grew cool, Miss Marple took a slow walk by the lakeside. The water lay still, reflecting the sky in tones of lavender and silver. The reeds stirred faintly, whispering secrets that only a patient ear might hear. Near the place where Arthur's body had been found, she paused. The ground was soft, but she saw no clear footprints now. The days had blurred them away. Yet her sharp eyes noticed something else. A faint scuff mark on a tree trunk, about the height of a man's head, as though a stick swung violently had struck it. She bent closer, her heart beating steadily, and traced the mark with one finger. A blow had been struck here, she was certain. Perhaps not the fatal one, but a blow nonetheless. And if the walking stick was missing, might it not have been the weapon? Standing there in the fading light, Miss Marple felt the first certainty take root in her mind. Thomas Weaver had not killed Arthur Pritchard, but someone had, and that someone was clever enough to let the villagers' gossip carry suspicion neatly toward the wrong person. The trick now was to see past the gossip, past the appearances, and to uncover the quiet, hidden truth. She straightened slowly, adjusted her shawl, and made her way home. The night air was cool, but her thoughts were warm with purpose. She would watch and listen and gather every small thread until the tapestry revealed itself, for she was quite sure of one thing. The truth lay not in anger, but in fear, and in the secrets people whispered only when they thought no one was listening. The next day, the atmosphere in the village had shifted from shock to a kind of feverish speculation. People spoke in lowered voices at the bakery and the post office, glancing about as though the murderer might be in earshot. It was the peculiar cruelty of village gossip, swift, relentless, and always just near enough to the truth to be dangerous. Miss Marple, who was well aware of this, noted how quickly Thomas Weaver's name was being passed around as though the matter were already settled. But Miss Marple's mind, always quietly observant, was turning elsewhere. The ribbon, the stick, and Lucy Price's overheard quarrel refused to leave her thoughts. These were not stray threads. They were the beginnings of a pattern, and so she determined, in her gentle but deliberate way, to learn a little more about the people most closely tied to Arthur Pritchard. Her first opportunity came that afternoon, when she encountered Mrs. Mortimer near the post office. Mrs. Mortimer, normally so composed, looked flustered. She wore her wide-brimmed hat, though the ribbon at its base was oddly mismatched. Plain cotton, hastily sewn in, rather than the satin that usually adorned it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered for just a moment on the bonnet, though her expression remained blandly pleasant. "My dear Mrs. Mortimer," she said, in her kindly way, "how dreadful this business is for the village. Such an unsettling affair, don't you think? Mrs. Mortimer gave a thin smile. Quite dreadful. Yes. Poor Arthur. Though I can't say I was surprised he came to grief sooner or later. Indeed. Miss Marple's voice was mild. Her head tilted ever so slightly. Oh, Mrs. Mortimer went on. He was the sort to make enemies, you know. Sharp with his tongue, sharp with his dealings. Men like that don't live peacefully. Miss Marple nodded. So true. Yet I wonder, my dear, if one can ever be fully prepared for such a sudden and violent end. One thinks of the family too, don't you? Did Arthur have anyone close besides, of course, his old housekeeper? The question made Mrs. Mortimer stiffen almost imperceptibly. She smoothed her gloves and replied, No, I should think not. He was a solitary man. Then, with a brisk nod, she excused herself and walked quickly away, leaving Miss Marple to watch her retreating figure with thoughtful eyes. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Lucy Price under the pretense of bringing some roses for the vicar's wife. She found Lucy in the garden, clipping herbs. The girl's face was drawn, worry shadowing her youthful features. I wondered, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, if you might tell me exactly what you heard that night. Every detail, no matter how small. Lucy hesitated, then whispered, It was Mrs. Mortimer. I'm sure of it. She was telling Arthur something about a promise, something he'd threatened to reveal. He laughed and called her a fool. That's all I caught before I hurried away. Miss Marple's knitting bag shifted on her arm as she considered this. A promise, a threat, and laughter that mocked. Yes, that sounded very like Arthur Pritchard, and it sounded very like a motive. On her walk home, she found herself near the Mortimer property. It was not by accident. Miss Marple rarely did anything without intent. She noted the hedge along the lane thick and high, but with a narrow path leading around the side of the house. There, caught on a thorn, was another scrap of ribbon, pale pink satin, frayed at the edge. She plucked it free and tucked it neatly beside the one she had found earlier. At supper, as she sipped her tea, Miss Marple arranged her thoughts. Mrs. Mortimer had quarrelled with Arthur. Her bonnet was missing its proper ribbon, and Arthur's stick was gone, perhaps used as a weapon. But the pieces, while suggestive, were not yet enough. What she needed was to see Mrs. Mortimer's reaction to being pressed. Not directly, of course, but with a nudge so subtle it would appear no more than an old lady's harmless chatter. That chance arrived sooner than she expected. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself seated beside Mrs. Mortimer at the Women's Institute meeting. The talk was of flower arrangements. Yet, Miss Marple, in her gentle voice, observed, Such pretty ribbons are used these days. I found a lovely pink one near the green, though sadly torn. One does wonder how such things come to be lost. For a fleeting second, Mrs. Mortimer's hand trembled against her lap, and her mouth tightened. Then she laughed lightly. Oh, ribbons do get caught on brambles easily. I've lost more than I can count. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes downcast as she smoothed her knitting. But inwardly she noted the tremor, the forced laughter. To the rest of the ladies, it had been nothing at all. But to Miss Marple, it was confirmation. That night, in her sitting room, with the fire burning low, she reviewed all she had learned. The truth was drawing closer. Arthur had held something over Mrs. Mortimer, something she could not afford to have revealed. He had mocked her, as was his way, and she had struck back. Whether in rage or in fear, it hardly mattered. What mattered was that she had not accounted for the quiet, watchful eyes of an old lady who saw everything. The pieces were almost ready to fall into place. Only one question remained. What secret had Arthur threatened to expose? The answer to that, Miss Marple knew, would not only prove motive, but would seal the matter beyond all doubt, and she intended to find it. The village had not yet settled after Arthur Pritchard's death when a new shock rippled through St. Aldwyth. It happened quietly, almost innocuously, and yet its effect was immediate. Early one morning, the vicar's wife discovered that her teacups, laid out for the Women's Institute meeting, had been sprinkled with a fine powder, bitter and unmistakably poisonous. Fortunately, she had sniffed it before pouring the tea, and no harm was done. News travelled quickly. The village was aflutter with speculation, even more so than after Arthur's drowning. Who would attempt such a thing? And why? Had the murderer grown bold, attempting to strike again so soon? Or was this the work of someone entirely different? A grudge born in secret, independent of the lake tragedy. Inspector Graves arrived at once, clipboard in hand, his mustache bristling with impatience. He examined the teacups, the sugar bowl, and the small silver teapot, noting their positions and the traces of powder. "Someone is playing a dangerous game," he muttered. "Clearly, we have an attempt on life here. And it complicates the original case, doesn't it?" The villagers, naturally, leapt to conclusions. "It must be the same person who drowned Pritchard," declared Mrs. Dawes with a dramatic gasp. "And perhaps the boy Thomas is even bolder than we thought." But Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, shook her head. There was something about the incident that did not fit the pattern of Thomas Weaver's anger or temperament. The boy's heat of temper had led to quarrels, yes, but not to subtle and careful attempts at poisoning that required patience, knowledge, and a steady hand. It was deliberate, calculated. She wandered later that morning to the edge of the lake, where the events of the fete still lingered in memory. The reeds swayed gently in the breeze, and the water shimmered in pale sunlight. Miss Marple thought of the missing ribbon, the walking stick, and Lucy Price's account of Miss Mortimer's quarrel with Arthur. None of these, she realized, were connected to Thomas in any way. This new attempt at murder, clever and quiet, suggested someone entirely different, or someone who had planned both incidents with care. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lydia Fenton, who seemed unusually agitated. She had come to speak to Miss Marple privately. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, wringing her hand. "Everyone thinks I had something to do with Arthur's death because we were often seen talking, but I had nothing to do with it. And now this poisoning." Miss Marple nodded gently, listening as the young widow poured out her fears. "It is difficult," Lydia said, "because the village does not distinguish between those who hate Arthur and those who merely disliked him. She paused, glancing about nervously. "I have seen someone hanging near the vicarage late at night, moving quickly and trying not to be seen. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but now—" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You are observant, Lydia. That is most useful." She thought to herself that the killer's recklessness or overconfidence was beginning to show. Small details, easily dismissed, were emerging as signs of a hidden hand at work. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. The vicar was in his study, fussing over papers, while his wife insisted that she had been lucky to avoid harm. "But think, Miss Marple," she said, "what a dreadful thing it would have been had someone not noticed the powder. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple considered this in her gentle, unhurried way. "I suspect," she said softly, "that the person responsible is clever and careful, though perhaps overconfident in the knowledge that villagers tend to suspect the wrong person." By evening, word had spread that both incidents, the drowning and the attempted poisoning, might be connected. The villagers debated and argued, suspicion leaping from Thomas Weaver to Mrs. Mortimer, to Lydia Fenton, even to Colonel Mortimer himself. Everyone had a theory, and everyone was wrong in equal measure. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her cottage with her knitting, allowed herself a small smile. The twist, the second incident, had only served to reveal the true character of the person who would seek harm: cunning, calculating, and careful to mask motive. Thomas was innocent. Mrs. Mortimer was nervous but not reckless. Lydia's fear, though real, was not guilt. The puzzle was sharpening, edges becoming more distinct. As the moon rose over Kingfisher Lake that night, Miss Marple considered her next steps. She would have to set subtle tests, small observations, gentle prods that would reveal the killer's character without alarming them. The second incident, far from confusing matters, had illuminated the path forward. The real murderer, she thought, would soon show themselves through a lapse. Something small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to a patient eye. And Miss Marple, with her quiet composure, was ready to watch. Miss Marple had learned, through a long life of observation, that the human heart often betrayed itself in the smallest ways. A glance too quick, a hesitation too long, the tremor of a hand when a certain subject was mentioned. These were the true footprints of character, far more telling than any physical evidence. And now, with the strange events surrounding Arthur Pritchard's death and the attempted poisoning, she knew it was time to watch more closely. The following morning, she took her customary walk through the village, nodding politely to those she met, while her mind considered the best way to test her suspicions. The ribbon, the missing walking stick, Miss Mortimer's quarrelled words with Arthur, and the whispered voices Thomas Weaver had overheard all suggested a pattern. Yet, to connect the dots fully, she would need reactions, not merely observations. People revealed far more when confronted. Subtly, of course, with the right provocation. Her first visit was to Mrs. Mortimer, under the pretense of inquiring about the Women's Institute meeting. "You will have had a dreadful few days," she said gently, settling into an armchair. "I imagine the aftermath of the fete has been quite unsettling for everyone, though for some more than others." Mrs. Mortimer's fingers resting on her lap twitched slightly. She glanced at Miss Marple, her face composed but her eyes wary. "Yes, of course," she replied. "It has been trying." Miss Marple allowed her words to linger, then casually added, "It is curious how small things can provoke such unease, isn't it? A ribbon lost, a walking stick gone, even a simple disagreement overheard can change the way one views a person entirely." Mrs. Mortimer's hand moved slightly as though to smooth her gloves, but the motion was nervous rather than habitual. "Yes, curious," she murmured. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, sipping her tea. "And one can see how a quarrel might lead to rash action, though of course one hopes not. It is remarkable, however, how people's tempers rise when they feel threatened, isn't it?" Mrs. Mortimer gave a small cough, then smiled tightly. "Threatened? I do not know what you mean, Miss Marple." "That is perfectly natural," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "It is only human to deny such feelings when they touch upon delicate matters." Leaving Mrs. Mortimer, Miss Marple felt a quiet affirmation in her mind. The subtle tremor, the overly controlled laughter, the momentary flush of color, these were signs of someone hiding more than mere embarrassment. Next, she visited Lydia Fenton. "I wondered if you might tell me again about what you heard that night," Miss Marple said, settling beside her. "Details, no matter how small, often prove useful." Lydia's eyes widened, and her hands twisted in her lap. "It was only a moment, Miss Marple." Mrs. Mortimer spoke sharply to Arthur, and he laughed, mocking, cruel. I didn't understand what she was saying, but it was urgent, almost fearful. Then he laughed again, and I left. Miss Marple nodded. "Fear can be a very revealing emotion, my dear. It makes people act in ways they otherwise would not. And sometimes, fear leads to desperation." As she walked home that evening, Miss Marple considered everything she had observed that day. Both Mrs. Mortimer and Lydia Fenton had shown signs of concealed anxiety, but the nature of that anxiety was different. Lydia's was genuine terror, arising from the perceived danger of events beyond her control. Mrs. Mortimer's, however, was the anxiousness of someone whose secrets were at risk of exposure, a subtle, practiced fear. Returning to her cottage, she sat by the window, knitting idly while her mind traced the threads of the unfolding mystery. The lake, the fete, the quarrel, the missing ribbon, the absent walking stick, all these details wove a pattern that no one else seemed to notice. She reflected on Thomas Weaver's innocence, which she now felt certain of, and considered the real culprit, whose anxiety was beginning to betray them. Miss Marple knew that her next steps must be careful. She would allow her observations to continue, perhaps stage a small encounter that would make the guilty party reveal themselves in word or gesture. The game, after all, was one of patience and subtlety. She smiled faintly at the thought. The truth always had a way of showing itself, especially to someone who had learned to watch without being watched. By the time the moon rose over the lake, spilling silver across the quiet water, Miss Marple was prepared. The threads were coming together. The pieces were ready to fall into place. And soon the true nature of the murderer would be revealed, not through force or accusation, but through the careful unraveling of human behavior, which she understood better than anyone. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with the certainty that the time had come to observe closely and to test the nerves of those who might be guilty. She had watched, listened, and gathered evidence in the form of human behavior, rather than any tangible object. Now, subtlety would do what conjecture and rumor could not: reveal the murderer. She prepared for the day as though it were any other. A tidy breakfast, a cup of tea, and her knitting bag on her arm. Her plan was simple but effective: invite those most closely involved to her cottage under various pretexts, allow casual conversation to flow, and watch for the smallest betrayal of emotion. Her first visitor was Lydia Fenton, called under the pretense of a friendly morning call. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, offering tea and biscuits. "I thought, my dear," she said lightly, "that you might enjoy the peace of a quiet morning away from all the talk. It is not easy to find such quiet in St. Aldwyth these days." Lydia's eyes widened with relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, that is kind. I cannot bear all the suspicion and whispers. I feel as though everyone is watching me. You're well aware, I imagine, that fear and suspicion are not always the same thing," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, almost incidental. "One can be afraid, yet entirely innocent." She watched Lydia closely, noting the way her hands trembled, the slight flush in her cheeks, the nervous glance toward the window. These were signs of anxiety, yes, but born of terror, not guilt. Next, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Mortimer, who arrived with her usual poise but eyes that darted nervously about the room. As she sat, Miss Marple began a seemingly idle conversation about the fate, the ribbons, and the lake. "It is strange," she said, "how small details, a ribbon here, a stick there, can change our perception of an entire event. One would think it merely trivial, yet even the smallest thing can be significant if one knows where to look." Mrs. Mortimer's hand twitched. She adjusted her gloves, and for a brief moment her composure slipped. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. "And sometimes," she added, "people act in ways they believe are unnoticed, thinking their secrets are safe, when in truth the world observes in subtle ways." A faint color rose in Mrs. Mortimer's cheeks, and she shifted uneasily. Her fingers played with a teacup handle far longer than necessary. Miss Marple, as she stirred her own tea, noted every gesture with quiet precision. It was as she expected: anxiety born of concealment, not fear of mere gossip. To confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple introduced a casual story about Arthur Pritchard, a man who held secrets over those around him, laughed cruelly at others, and might provoke an impulsive act. She observed Mrs. Mortimer's reaction carefully. The slight flicker of recognition in her eyes, the tightened lips, the tremor of her hands. It was all there, subtle but unmistakable. When Lydia, oblivious to the subtext, remarked how cruelly Arthur had treated so many, Mrs. Mortimer flinched. Miss Marple smiled gently, as though noting nothing. The effect, however, was profound. She had not accused, she had not demanded, she had merely allowed conversation to flow, and the guilty heart had betrayed itself. Later that day, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief stroll by the lake. The reeds rustled, the water shimmered in pale sunlight, and she considered the unfolding puzzle. The pieces were now clear. Thomas Weaver was innocent. Lydia Fenton feared but did not conceal. Miss Mortimer, with her quarrel, her hidden anxieties, and her carefully controlled demeanor, was the one whose secrets aligned with the pattern of events. By evening, Miss Marple was confident. The ribbon, torn in haste, suggested Mrs. Mortimer's presence at the lake. The missing walking stick, likely the instrument of violence, had been carried away to hide evidence. The whispered quarrel confirmed motive. It was not anger or accident, nor the impulsiveness of a young man, but deliberate action guided by fear of exposure. Sitting by her window as the moon rose over Kingfisher Lake, Miss Marple reflected on human nature. She understood the subtleties of motive, the delicate balances of fear and secrecy, and how, with patience and observation, truth could be revealed without confrontation or accusation. And she knew that tomorrow, gently but decisively, she would expose the real murderer. For in the quiet village of St. Aldwyth, there were secrets best uncovered with subtlety, and Miss Marple had learned to wait, to watch, and to trust the smallest signs. The morning dawned crisp and clear over St. Aldwyth, with a light mist curling above Kingfisher Lake. The village seemed for a moment almost serene, as though it had forgotten the tremors of fear and suspicion that had gripped it for days. Yet beneath that quiet, Miss Marple moved with a purpose born of patience and careful observation. Today, the story would find its conclusion. She arrived at the vicarage, inviting those most closely involved under the guise of a friendly morning tea. Thomas Weaver came first, pale but relieved at the warm welcome. Lydia Fenton followed, glancing nervously around the room, while Mrs. Mortimer entered last, composed yet slightly on edge, her gloves smoothed with attention. Miss Marple could not have missed. As the tea was poured, Miss Marple began her gentle narrative. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how ordinary events can conceal extraordinary truths. The fete by the lake was meant to be a pleasant gathering, yet it has brought out both the best and the worst in people." She paused, letting her words sink in, and then spoke of the torn ribbon discovered by the Green, and the missing walking stick, held by someone who wished to conceal its purpose. She recounted the observations of Lucy Price, the quarrel, the raised voices, and Arthur Pritchard's mocking laughter, and the subtle gestures, the fleeting signs which revealed so much more than words alone could convey. Mrs. Mortimer shifted slightly, her composure faltering just a fraction. Miss Marple noted every detail: the tightened lips, the small tremor in her hands, the avoidance of direct eye contact. The story was unfolding not as accusation, but as gentle illumination, and the guilty heart responded instinctively. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the drowning at the lake was no accident, nor the outburst of a hot-tempered youth. The young man, Thomas Weaver, was innocent, though naturally frightened and misunderstood. Nor was Lydia Fenton implicated, despite her understandable fear. The truth, however, lies elsewhere." She looked at Mrs. Mortimer with the calm clarity of one who has long observed human nature. "Mrs. Mortimer, you quarreled with Arthur Pritchard over a matter you wished to keep hidden. His laughter, his threat to reveal what you had carefully concealed, drove you to act in a way you thought would remain unnoticed. The walking stick, the quarrel, the torn ribbon, every detail fits the pattern of your action. The powder in the teacups was a further attempt, born of desperation to protect yourself from exposure." Mrs. Mortimer's composure broke, a pale flush spreading across her cheeks. She lowered her eyes, lips trembling. "I did not mean. I only—" Her voice faltered as the weight of her deeds became undeniable. Miss Marple nodded gently. "You acted out of fear and the desire to conceal a secret, not from malice alone, but concealment cannot erase what has occurred. Every human gesture leaves its mark, and every secret has a way of revealing itself, even when one believes it well hidden." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Even Thomas and Lydia, initially anxious, felt a cautious relief, innocence restored, the true pattern now clear. Inspector Graves, who had arrived quietly behind the scene, adjusted his spectacles with a mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration. Miss Marple's deductions, subtle and patient, had revealed what months of conventional investigation might have missed. Mrs. Mortimer, pale and defeated, was led gently from the room by the inspector, who promised fair proceedings and careful attention to the circumstances of her actions. The villagers, once buzzing with speculation, would soon learn the truth in a measured and accurate account, preserving the balance of justice and understanding. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the sun glinting off the lake in silver tones. She settled into her favorite chair by the window, knitting quietly as though nothing had happened. The village, now aware of the real sequence of events, would slowly return to its rhythms, though a faint tremor of unease lingered, a reminder that human nature in its complexity could never be entirely trusted. Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled to herself. The truth, as always, had been revealed, not by force or accusation, but through the careful observation of small signs, the patient tracing of human behavior, and the gentle guidance of understanding over judgment. Life in Aldwyth would continue, the lake glimmering peacefully under the late afternoon sun, and the lessons of fear, secrecy, and subtle deception would remain quietly in the minds of those who had witnessed them, and Miss Marple, serene and composed, prepared for the next mystery that human nature would inevitably provide.